There are places in America that were never meant to appear on a map. Places where the earth itself seems to remember something the people tried desperately to erase. And if you listen closely enough, if you learn to hear the quiet beneath the official stories, you begin to understand something unsettling. Some histories weren't lost, they were buried. Not by time, by design. In the hills of eastern Tennessee, sometime in the 1800s, there was a cabin that officially did not exist. No deed, no census entry, no church registry, no tax record, no land transfer, nothing that would allow a historian, even today, to point to a coordinate and say with certainty, "Here." And yet, the whispers remained. Farmers spoke about it in low voices. Travelers who wandered too far into the wooded ridges would sometimes glimpse something impossible. Children moving between trees where no families lived. Children who, when spoken to, never answered. Children who watched, measured, and disappeared. Men who asked too many questions were told something simple and final. Those children belong to the hills. Now, understand something important before we go further. This story isn't just about a cabin, it's about something far more dangerous. It's about the kind of system that can exist outside official power and survive precisely because the powerful never see it clearly. A hidden network, an invisible school, a quiet rebellion built one mind at a time. Most people think control is maintained with armies and laws, but the truth men eventually learn, the truth institutions fear, is that control is maintained through something far older: ignorance. Because a person who cannot read cannot see the chains, but a person who can read, who can think, who understands how the world actually works, that person becomes difficult to own. And somewhere in those Tennessee hills, long before modern men began talking about psychological control systems, hidden agendas, and institutional manipulation, one woman had already understood the entire game. She built a place with no windows, not because she was hiding from the world, but because she was hiding the world's future from the people who thought they owned it. And the first man who stumbled onto that secret, an Elias Pewitt named government census enumerator, would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what he had truly seen. Because once you notice something that isn't supposed to exist, you can never unknow it. And the deeper he looked, the more he realized something that should make every thinking man uneasy. Those children in the woods, they weren't lost. They were being prepared. And the people who ran the official system, the courts, the records, the government ledgers, had absolutely no idea what was growing just beyond the edge of their authority.
Elias Pewitt was not the kind of man history remembers. He was not a soldier, not a politician, not a preacher with a voice loud enough to shake a church roof. He was something far more dangerous to systems built on quiet deception. He was a man who noticed things. In 1870, the United States government launched the first federal census after the Civil War. On paper, it was supposed to be a simple administrative task: count the people, record the households, map the nation again after years of chaos. But in reality, the census was something else entirely. It was the first real attempt to measure a country that had just been shattered and rebuilt in ways no official document could fully capture. Count every person, every household, every life. That was the instruction. But instructions written in government ink often collide with realities that exist far outside government awareness, especially in the hills, especially in the South, especially in places where the land itself holds secrets older than the country trying to count it. Elias Pewitt was 31 years old when he was assigned to enumerate a section of rural Tennessee, Overton County, hill country, broken ground, the kind of place where farms sat miles apart and the people who lived there preferred things that way. To most census workers, the job was tedious. To Puett, it was a puzzle. He carried 2 books everywhere he went. One was the official government ledger, the one with neat columns for names, ages, occupations, and property. The other was a small private notebook made of worn leather. That book had no columns, only observations, questions, things that didn't fit neatly into a government form. Men like Puett have always been dangerous to systems that rely on tidy records, because the moment something doesn't fit the record, they start asking why. Late in the summer of 1870, after weeks of walking dusty farm roads and knocking on doors, Puett found himself following a narrow creek path that didn't appear on the county map he had been given. Harrow Creek, at least that's what locals called it, though even then the name seemed to slide away whenever he asked someone to mark its exact location. The path curved through tall tulip poplar trees. The air was thick with moisture and the sound of running water somewhere below the ridge. And that's where he saw them. 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. They stood at the edge of the creek as if they had been waiting there. The girls looked perhaps 8 and 10, the boy younger, 6 maybe. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Children in rural counties often wandered. But then Puett noticed something that unsettled him immediately. They weren't playing. They were watching him, not with curiosity, not with fear, but with a strange, silent calculation that no child should possess. He raised a hand in greeting. "Where do you live?" No answer. He pointed toward the ridge. "Up there?" The older girl slowly turned her head toward the hill, as if checking something, then looked back at him, still silent. And then something happened that Puett would later write about in his private notebook with a single unsettling sentence. 3 children seen near Harrow Creek crossing. None claimed by any household visited since. Inquiry avoided by locals. And beneath that line he wrote something even more telling. They did not appear lost. They appeared placed. And once a man begins to suspect placement, he starts asking a different kind of question. Not who are they, but who put them there.
A careful man always begins with the obvious question first. Who do the children belong to? It sounds simple. In rural counties during the 1800s, children rarely existed without a household attached to them. Even if a family was poor, even if they lived miles from the nearest road, someone always knew whose children they were. That was the structure of the world. Or at least, the structure the world preferred to believe in. The next day, Elias Puett began asking questions. Casually at first, the way a man asks about weather or crops while leaning against a fence post. "Passed 3 children down by Harrow Creek yesterday," he mentioned to the owner of the Jervin farm. "Figured they must belong somewhere up the ridge." The farmer paused for only a fraction of a second, but men like Puett notice fractions. The pause was small, too small for most people to detect. Then the man shrugged. "Children run wild out there." Puett nodded, made no argument, but he watched the farmer's wife across the yard, hanging wet clothes on a line. She had heard the conversation, and she never once looked up. That was the first signal. Silence in rural communities has many forms. Sometimes people talk too much. Sometimes they change the subject. But the most powerful silence is something else entirely. The silence of people who have already decided the topic does not exist. Puett visited 2 more farms that day. Same response, different versions of the same deflection. A tenant farmer named Waddell laughed when Puett asked about the children. "Plenty of hill brats around here," he said, scratching tobacco stains from his beard. "You'll see all sorts if you wander long enough." But the laugh was wrong, too practiced, too quick. And then Waddell added something that seemed harmless on the surface. "Nothing to put in a government book." Puett wrote that exact sentence in his private notebook later that evening, because those words revealed something important. Waddell hadn't said there were no children. He had said the children were not for the record. Now understand the difference. One is denial, the other is a boundary, and boundaries imply something is being protected. By the end of the week, Elias Pewitt had visited every household within several miles of Harrow Creek. He recorded every name, every family, every child. But the 3 children from the creek appeared nowhere in the official census ledger. No household claimed them, no parent mentioned them, no record existed. And yet the farmers clearly knew something. Not fear, not exactly, something closer to agreement. A quiet understanding that whatever lived beyond the ridge was not to be disturbed. Pewitt submitted his official census report the following week. Government complete, numbers recorded, columns filled. But the children never entered the federal record because the government only counts what it can see. And in every age there are places where entire lives unfold outside that vision. Most men would have closed the matter there, filed it away, moved on. But Elias Pewitt had a flaw that made him deeply inconvenient to the orderly systems he served. He hated unfinished accounts, especially the kind where everyone around him pretended nothing unusual existed. And so, 1 month later, with no official orders and no real reason to return, he rode back toward Harrow Creek, not as a census worker, not as a government man, but something far more dangerous, a curious one. Because curiosity is the first crack in every controlled narrative. And what Pewitt found waiting in the hills above that creek was something the official world had never intended to acknowledge.
Most men, standing in front of a cabin like that, would feel something primal rise in their chest. A warning. The same instinct that once kept our ancestors alive in forests full of predators, the sense that something is wrong here, and that continuing forward might pull you into a story you will never fully escape. Elias Pewitt felt it too. But the difference between ordinary men and the men who change the shape of truth is simple. Ordinary men listen to that warning. Curious men ignore it. The cabin sat partially buried into the slope of the hill, as if the earth itself had tried to reclaim it over the years. The logs were dark with age and moisture, almost black in places. Whoever built it had done so carefully, the seams tight, the structure low and solid. But the absence of windows was impossible to ignore. Windows are not luxuries in cabins, they are necessities. Light, air, awareness of what approaches. Removing them changes the purpose of a building entirely. It transforms a home into something else, a container. Pewitt stepped closer to the door. The voices inside were faint but unmistakable. More than one child, possibly 4, maybe more. Soft conversation. Then the creak of the wooden porch board beneath his boot betrayed his presence. Instant silence. Not the gradual quieting of children realizing a stranger has arrived. No, this silence was immediate, total. The kind of silence that comes from discipline, from training. Pewitt knocked once. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. "I'm a census enumerator," he called through the door. "Just here to complete my records." Nothing. He waited. The forest behind him rustled with wind moving through the tall tulip poplar trees. Somewhere down the hill, the creek continued its patient movement over stone. Still no sound inside the cabin. He raised his hand to knock again, and before his knuckles touched the wood, the door opened, slowly. Not wide, just enough to reveal the woman standing behind it. She was thin. Older than 40, younger than 60, the kind of face where time had settled quietly rather than violently. Her dress was simple homespun, her posture calm. But what struck Pewitt immediately was her expression. Not surprise,
not suspicion, recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. "You came up the ridge," she said. Her voice was steady, quiet. Poot nodded slightly. "I saw some children near the creek, wanted to make sure they're counted properly." The woman studied him for a few seconds longer than most people would consider polite. Then she answered, "They wander." The answer floated between them, simple, closed. Poot tried again. "How many people live here?" "Enough." "What's your name?" "Nora." He waited for the rest. There was none. "No family name?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "None worth writing down." That response alone told Poot more than a full page of answers might have. People who avoid records understand something about the power of records. He leaned slightly to see inside the cabin. For just a moment, the angle of the open door allowed him a glimpse of the interior. 4 children sat against the far wall, perfectly still, watching him, not whispering, not fidgeting, watching. The same way the 3 children at the creek had watched, measuring, evaluating. Poot felt a strange sensation then, something that would stay with him long after this conversation ended. The feeling that he was not the one investigating them. They were investigating him. Then Nora spoke again, quietly, almost gently. "If I were you, I wouldn't write us down." It was not a threat. That's important. Elias Poot would underline that detail in his notebook later. It was advice, the kind of advice someone gives a traveler when warning about a dangerous road ahead. Poot looked past her again toward the children. They hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't looked away. And in that moment, he realized something that would disturb him for the rest of his life. Those children weren't being hidden from the world. They were being prepared for it. And whatever was happening inside that windowless cabin had been happening for a long time. He left shortly after, but that night, by lantern light, Elias Poot filled 3 full pages of his private notebook with a realization that would pull him deeper into a mystery the official world had never recorded. The cabin did not exist in any government document. The land had no registered owner. The woman had no surname, and the children had no households. And the entire surrounding community had quietly agreed not to see any of it. Which raised a far dangerous question. What kind of secret makes an entire community choose silence? And why did it begin the exact moment the Civil War ended?
Most men standing in front of a cabin like that would feel something primal rise in their chest. A warning. The same instinct that once kept our ancestors alive in forests full of predators. The sense that something is wrong here, and that continuing forward might pull you into a story you will never fully escape. Elias Puett felt it too, but the difference between ordinary men and the men who change the shape of truth is simple. Ordinary men listen to that warning. Curious men ignore it. The cabin sat partially buried into the slope of the hill, as if the earth itself had tried to reclaim it over the years. The logs were dark with age and moisture, almost black in places. Whoever built it had done so carefully, the seams tight, the structure low and solid. But the absence of windows was impossible to ignore. Windows are not luxuries in cabins, they are necessities. Light, air, awareness of what approaches. Removing them changes the purpose of a building entirely. It transforms a home into something else, a container. Puett stepped closer to the door. The voices inside were faint but unmistakable. More than one child, possibly 4, maybe more. Soft conversation. Then the creak of the wooden porch board beneath his boot betrayed his presence. Instant silence. Not the gradual quieting of children realizing a stranger has arrived. No, this silence was immediate, total, the kind of silence that comes from discipline, from training. Puett knocked once. No answer.
He knocked again, louder this time. "I'm a census enumerator," he called through the door. "Just here to complete my records." Nothing. He waited. The forest behind him rustled with wind moving through the tall tulip poplar trees. Somewhere down the hill, the creek continued its patient movement over stone. Still no sound inside the cabin. He raised his hand to knock again, and before his knuckles touched the wood, the door opened, slowly, not wide, just enough to reveal the woman standing behind it. She was thin, older than 40, younger than 60, the kind of face where time had settled quietly rather than violently. Her dress was simple homespun, her posture calm. But what struck Pewitt immediately was her expression. Not surprise, not suspicion, recognition, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. "You came up the ridge," she said. Her voice was steady, quiet. Pewitt nodded slightly. "I saw some children near the creek, wanted to make sure they're counted properly." The woman studied him for a few seconds longer than most people would consider polite. Then she answered, "They wander." The answer floated between them, simple, closed. Pewitt tried again. "How many people live here?" "Enough." "What's your name?" "Nora." He waited for the rest. There was none. "No family name?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "None worth writing down." That response alone told Pewitt more than a full page of answers might have. People who avoid records understand something about the power of records. He leaned slightly to see inside the cabin. For just a moment, the angle of the open door allowed him a glimpse of the interior. 4 children sat against the far wall, perfectly still, watching him, not whispering, not fidgeting, watching, the same way the 3 children at the creek had watched, measuring, evaluating. Pewitt felt a strange sensation then, something that would stay with him long after this conversation ended. The feeling that he was not the one investigating them, they were investigating him. Then Nora spoke again, quietly, almost gently. "If I were you," she said, "I wouldn't write us down." It was not a threat. That's important. Elias Pewitt would underline that detail in his notebook later. It was advice, the kind of advice someone gives a traveler when warning about a dangerous road ahead. Pewitt looked past her again toward the children. They hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't looked away. And in that moment, he realized something that would disturb him for the rest of his life. Those children weren't being hidden from the world. They were being prepared for it. And whatever was happening inside that windowless cabin had been happening for a very long time. He left shortly after, but that night, by lantern light, Elias Pewitt filled 3 full pages of his private notebook with a realization that would pull him deeper into a mystery the official world had never recorded. The cabin did not exist in any government document. The land had no registered owner. The woman had no surname, and the entire surrounding community had quietly agreed not to see any of it. Which raised a far more dangerous question. What kind of secret makes an entire community choose silence, and why did it begin the exact moment the Civil War ended?
What Nora built in those hills was not chaos. It was structure. That is the first thing Elias Pewitt realized when he returned to the cabin years later and finally sat long enough to observe what was actually happening inside those log walls. To an outsider, the place would have looked like poverty. 1 room, dirt floor, a rough wooden table, shelves made from salvaged planks, bundles of cloth stacked in corners. But men who pay attention understand something most people miss. True systems often look simple on the surface, because complexity attracts attention. Simplicity hides power. When Pewitt stepped inside the cabin during his second long visit, the first thing he noticed was the books. Not decorative books, not the polished leather volumes you might see in a church or lawyer's office. These were battered things, pages loose, covers missing, some bound together with cord or twine. But there were many of them, more than you would expect in a place that officially did not exist. Then he noticed something else. Every child in that room was watching him with the same silent discipline he had seen years earlier near the creek. Not fear, focus, the kind of focus soldiers are taught, or students. Nora gestured for him to sit. She poured him a cup of bitter chicory tea and sat across from him with the calm patience of someone who understood that questions were coming. And questions did come. For 3 hours, Elias Pewitt asked everything he could think of: where the children came from, how long they stayed, how she fed them, how she avoided attention. Most of his questions were met with the same careful, partial answers, but slowly enough pieces appeared for the picture to become clear. The cabin was never meant to keep children forever. It was a passage, a transformation point. Children arrived broken in different ways. Some were war orphans. Some had been separated from parents during the chaos of the Civil War. Some had simply been left behind by adults who could not keep them alive during migration north. And occasionally, a child arrived because someone knew the truth. Someone knew there was a woman in the hills who could do something very specific. She could teach. That was the real purpose of the cabin, not hiding, teaching. Nora had built a system where the older children taught the younger ones. Every skill passed forward: reading, writing, numbers, observation, memory. The books on the shelf weren't just reading material, they were tools. Every child learned from them and then became the teacher for the next child who arrived. Think about the elegance of that design. It required almost no resources, no funding, no official approval, and yet the knowledge multiplied with every new arrival. Pewitt eventually asked the question that had been bothering him since the moment he first walked around the cabin. "The windows," he said. "Why build a house without them?" Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she gave an answer that would stay with him forever. "Windows let people see in," she said. "Not see out, see in." In that moment, Pewitt understood something subtle but profound. Most people believe privacy is about hiding yourself from the world. But Nora understood a deeper principle. Control systems watch constantly. Authorities observe. Power monitors. Windows make surveillance easy. A windowless cabin, however, remains unknowable. No one outside could ever tell how many children were inside, what they were learning, what they were becoming. And in a time when literacy itself was considered dangerous among freed populations, the cabin functioned like a vault filled not with money, but with minds being sharpened quietly. And that realization began to haunt Elias Pewitt, because once he understood what Nora was really doing, he understood something far darker about the world beyond that hill. A woman with no official authority, no funding, no recognition, had built a system that quietly protected and educated dozens of children the government had completely failed. Not through rebellion, not through violence, through silence, through discipline, through knowledge. And that kind of quiet power is something institutions rarely tolerate once they discover it exists, which meant one thing was almost inevitable. Eventually, someone in the official world would find out, and when systems of authority encounter something they cannot categorize, they do what they have always done. They move to control it or erase it. And Elias Pewitt, without fully understanding the consequences, was about to make the one mistake that would bring the entire weight of the official world crashing toward the cabin at Harrow Creek. He told someone.
Elias Pewitt didn't mean to start anything. That's the strange thing about turning points in history. They rarely begin with dramatic decisions.
More often, they begin with something small, a conversation, a passing remark, a moment where a man speaks before fully considering who might be listening. In Pewett's case, it happened in a county office. The building was little more than a wooden structure where land disputes, tax records, and census tallies were kept, a place filled with ledgers and tired clerks. Nothing about it suggested danger. But institutions don't always look powerful on the outside. Sometimes power hides in rooms that smell like ink and dust. Pewett had come in to deliver his census notes, pages filled with family names, farm sizes, livestock counts, births, deaths, routine information, the kind of paperwork that quietly defines how a government understands the people it governs. A clerk named Samuel Ridgway was reviewing the entries. Ridgway was the type of man every bureaucracy eventually produces, observant, patient, and deeply interested in patterns, the kind of mind that notices inconsistencies the way a hunter notices broken branches in the woods. He flipped through Pewett's pages slowly, line by line. Then he paused. "Something's odd here," Ridgway said. Pewett looked up. Ridgway tapped the ledger with a finger. "There are children in this district that don't belong to any recorded household." Now, most enumerators would have shrugged. Rural census work was messy. People moved, families split apart, records were incomplete. But Pewett hesitated, just for a moment. And in that moment, the memory of the cabin crept into his mind. The children, the books, the silent discipline. He should have said nothing, but silence is harder than people think. So he answered carefully. "There's a place up near Harrow Creek." Ridgway looked up. "What kind of place?" "A woman keeps children there, teaches them." Pewett thought about Nora's shelves, the battered books, the children reading aloud in steady voices. "Reading," he said. That one word changed everything. Because in the late 1800s, reading was not just a harmless skill in certain parts of America. It was power. Power that many systems were still trying to tightly control. Ridgway didn't react immediately. He simply closed the ledger and rested his hands on the desk. "How many children?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Pewett said. 10, maybe more?" Ridgway nodded slowly. Then he did something that seemed completely ordinary. He wrote a note, folded it, sealed it with wax, and placed it in a small outgoing correspondence box. To Pewett, it looked like routine bureaucracy. But what he didn't know was that Ridgway was not merely a clerk. He also served as an information relay for the Regional Education Office, a system that had recently begun investigating unauthorized schools in rural districts. Most of those investigations had nothing to do with children's safety. They were about control, licensing, authority, the idea that learning itself needed to be supervised. Within 2 weeks, that sealed note reached a desk in Knoxville. Within 4 weeks, an inspector had been assigned, and within 6 weeks, 3 men on horseback were riding toward Harrow Creek with official documents tucked inside their coats. Orders to investigate, orders to register every child present, orders to determine whether the school operating outside the county's authority should be shut down. None of them knew what they were walking into, because what Nora had built in that cabin wasn't just a classroom. It was something far more dangerous to systems that relied on quiet obedience. It was a place where children were learning how to think. And once thinking spreads, it becomes very difficult to contain, especially in a valley where the trees have long memories and the people who live there understand something outsiders rarely do. The hills don't belong to the government. They belong to the ones who know how to disappear inside them.
The 3 riders reached Harrow Creek just before sunset.
Men who travel for authority always believe the papers in their coat pockets give them power everywhere they go. Those documents carried the seal of the county education office, signed in proper ink, stamped with the official mark of Tennessee. To the men riding those horses, that seal meant legitimacy. But legitimacy only matters in places that recognize it, and Harrow Creek was not one of those places. The lead rider was Inspector Daniel Mercer, a tall, careful man who had spent years traveling rural districts. His job was simple: find unregistered schools, investigate them, and bring them into the official system. Behind him rode 2 deputies sent by the county office. Not soldiers, but men who carried the quiet confidence that comes from representing a distant authority. As they moved through the wooded valley, Mercer began noticing something strange. The land wasn't empty. He could feel it. Not in the obvious way. There were no houses nearby, no farms, no livestock sounds. But every so often he caught movement. A shadow behind a tree, a figure far up the hillside that disappeared when he looked directly at it. Children, watching. He slowed his horse. "Did you see that?" one of the deputies asked quietly. Mercer nodded. "Yes." But none of the children approached. None spoke. They simply observed the riders as they passed through the narrow path that followed the creek. Mercer had spent enough time in remote places to recognize something unusual when he saw it. These children were not curious. They were assessing, as if the riders themselves were being studied. After another mile, the cabin appeared. Simple, small, exactly the sort of place a person might overlook entirely if they didn't know to look for it. No windows. That detail immediately bothered Mercer. "Strange design," one deputy muttered. Mercer dismounted slowly. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was inside. He walked toward the door and knocked. 3 steady taps. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. Nora stood there exactly as Elias Pewitt had described her years earlier. Gray hair pulled back, plain dress, eyes that seemed to evaluate a person faster than most people could speak. Mercer removed his hat politely. "Ma'am," he said, "my name is Daniel Mercer. I'm here on behalf of the county education office." Nora said nothing. The deputies shifted slightly behind him. Mercer continued. "We've received information that children are being instructed here. By law, any school operating in this district must be registered and inspected." Still no reply. Silence stretched long enough that Mercer became aware of something else. The woods behind him had grown quieter. He turned slightly. More children had appeared among the trees. Not dozens, but enough to make the scene unsettling. Watching. Always watching. Mercer turned to Nora. "I'd like to come inside," he said calmly, "speak with you about the situation." For the first time, Nora spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You came a long way for something you don't understand." Mercer had heard resistance before. Many rural families distrusted government officials, but this felt different. "This is a simple matter," he said. "If you're teaching children, the county requires—" "No," Nora said. Not loudly, but with a certainty that stopped him mid-sentence. She stepped aside slightly so he could see inside. The cabin. Children sat around the table, books open, reading, learning. Mercer counted quickly. 12, maybe 13, far more than the note had suggested. "You see the problem," Mercer said gently. "This must be documented, names recorded, guardians identified." Nora watched him with that same steady gaze. "These children already belong somewhere," she said. Mercer frowned slightly. "Where?" She gestured toward the hills. "Here." One of the deputies chuckled under his breath. Mercer ignored it. "Ma'am, I'm afraid that's not how the law works." Nora's eyes shifted briefly past Mercer, toward the tree line. Mercer followed her gaze. More children had appeared among the trees, not just a few now, dozens, standing silently between the trees, no talking, no movement, just watching.
It was then Mercer realized something unsettling. These children weren't just students. They were part of the system Nora had built. Messengers, observers, lookouts, an invisible network spread across the hills, which meant something else suddenly became clear to him. The three riders hadn't simply found the cabin. The cabin had known they were coming long before they arrived. Mercer slowly placed his hat back on his head. For the first time since leaving Knoxville, he felt uncertain. Not afraid, but aware that the neat lines of authority he represented might not apply here the way he expected. And Nora seemed to know it. "You can write whatever you like in your ledgers," he told him quietly, "but the hills won't read them." Behind Mercer, the forest stood full of silent witnesses, and for the first time, the inspector began to suspect something troubling. This place wasn't hiding from the system, it was operating completely outside of it, which raised a question no government office had ever considered. What happens when a community decides it no longer needs permission to educate its own children?
Inspector Daniel Mercer had dealt with stubborn people before. Frontier farmers, isolated families, small church schools run by pastors who believed the government had no place in their classrooms. But this felt different. Those situations always followed a familiar pattern: resistance, argument, negotiation, and eventually compliance. What stood before him at Harrow Creek wasn't resistance. It was indifference. Nora did not seem afraid of the law. More unsettling still, she didn't seem impressed by it. Mercer cleared his throat and stepped slightly closer to the cabin doorway. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this doesn't have to become a conflict." Behind him, the deputies shifted uneasily as more silent figures gathered among the trees. Mercer lowered his voice. "All I need are names, ages, a record of guardianship. After that, we can discuss registration." Nora studied him for a long moment. Then she asked the question he hadn't expected. "Do you know how far the nearest school is?" Mercer hesitated. 20 miles, she answered before he could speak. "One way." The inspector said nothing. She continued. "Do you know how many children in these hills can walk 40 miles every day?" Mercer knew the answer already. None. Nora stepped out onto the small wooden porch so the children inside the cabin could no longer hear the conversation clearly. "Do you know how many children died in this valley during the winter after the war?" Mercer felt the conversation slipping somewhere uncomfortable. "That isn't the matter at hand." 23, Nora said. "Most of them couldn't read their own names." The forest remained quiet. Mercer suddenly understood something he hadn't considered before writing here. For the county office, this investigation was paperwork. For Nora, it was history. "You're teaching them," Mercer said slowly. "Yes." "Without oversight?" "Yes." "Without state approval?" "Yes." Mercer sighed. "You understand I can't simply ignore that." Nora nodded. "I know." The answer surprised him. "You know?" "Yes." Mercer frowned. "Then why continue?" For the first time since he arrived, Nora smiled faintly. "Because the alternative is worse." Mercer gestured toward the woods. "You've built quite an arrangement here." Nora didn't look back at the children. "They built it." That answer lingered in the air. Mercer suddenly remembered something Elias Pewitt had written in the margins of his old census notes, a small line most clerks probably ignored. "Children here move like they're protecting something." He looked again at the silent figures among the trees. Older ones stood farther out, watching the trails. Younger ones stayed closer. Layers of awareness, a pattern, almost like lookouts. Messengers, a communication network. Mercer turned back to Nora. "How long has this been going on?" "Long enough." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you'll get." Mercer rubbed his forehead. This situation had already drifted far beyond what his instructions covered. The official protocol was simple: identify the school, record the students, and begin the process of bringing it under state supervision. But something about the place made that feel wrong, not illegal. Wrong. Because the truth was obvious now. These children weren't neglected. They were learning. Learning well. He glanced back inside the cabin again. One of the older boys was helping a younger girl sound out a difficult word from a book. Patiently, calmly. exactly the way trained teachers did. Mercer had seen enough classrooms to recognize genuine education when he saw it, which created a problem. The law assumed unauthorized schools were dangerous. This one clearly wasn't. In fact, it might be doing something the official system had failed to do. Mercer slowly removed the folded inspection paper from his coat pocket. The deputies behind him watched carefully. They expected him to begin reading the official order. Instead, Mercer folded the document again, then placed it back inside his coat. "You'll eventually be reported again," he said quietly. Nora nodded. "I know. Someone else might come. I know. They might not be as patient as I am. I know." Mercer studied her face. "You're not worried?" Nora finally looked past him toward the hills. "The hills have been here longer than governments." The inspector followed her gaze. Sunset was spreading across the ridges. The children among the trees had begun quietly drifting back into the forest paths, returning to wherever they had come from. Watching finished, network dissolving. Mercer realized something that made the back of his neck prickle. The system Nora built wasn't in that cabin. The cabin was only the center. The real school existed across the entire valley, which meant shutting down the building wouldn't stop anything. It would only scatter it. He turned back toward his horse. The deputies looked confused. "Sir?" one of them asked. Mercer mounted slowly. He looked once more at Nora standing on the porch. Then he said something that would never appear in any official report. "Teach them well." And with that, the three riders turned their horses and began the long ride back towards the official world. Behind them, the cabin at Harrow Creek remained exactly what it had always been, unrecorded, unregistered, and quietly shaping minds the system had never even counted. But far away in Knoxville, Samuel Ridgway's sealed note was already in another office, on another desk, being read by a man far less understanding than Inspector Mercer, a man who believed very strongly in one simple rule: anything outside the system must eventually be brought inside it, or removed. And unlike Mercer, that man was already preparing a second visit to Harrow Creek, one that would involve no conversation.
The report Inspector Daniel Mercer filed in Knoxville was, by every bureaucratic standard, incomplete. It contained no student names, no ages, no list of guardians, no formal accusation of unlawful instruction. Instead, it was filled with vague phrases that frustrated the clerks who reviewed it. Remote educational activity, children of uncertain residency, further inquiry recommended at a later time. Mercer understood something most career officials eventually learn. Paperwork can be used to slow things down, delay, blur the edges, give time for complicated realities to breathe before the machinery of authority crushes them flat. For a few months, that strategy worked. The cabin at Harrow Creek continued exactly as it had before. Children arrived quietly, others left quietly. Books moved from hand to hand. Lessons continued. The hills watched. But bureaucracy has its own momentum. Eventually, someone noticed Mercer's vague report and decided to look deeper. That someone was Edwin Hale, a regional supervisor in the state education office. Hale was the kind of man institutions often promote: precise, orderly, uncomfortable with ambiguity. Where Mercer saw a delicate situation that required patience, Hale saw something much simpler: a violation. To him, the matter was straightforward. An unauthorized school existed. A government inspector had failed to resolve it. Therefore, the problem required stronger action. Hale began reading the previous correspondence: Samuel Ridgway's note, Mercer's inspection summary, fragments of census records mentioning children without listed households. One detail bothered him more than anything else: the number. Every record hinted at more children than anyone could account for. 10, 12, sometimes 20, but no families attached to their names. That suggested something deeply irregular, and irregular things made Hale suspicious. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair.
Unregistered populations, he murmured. In the late 1800s, that phrase carried a particular weight. Populations outside records were difficult to control, difficult to tax, difficult to govern, and institutions dislike uncertainty. So Hale prepared a new directive, not an inspection, an enforcement visit. 6 men instead of 3, 2 armed deputies, and written authority to close the school immediately. If necessary, the children would be relocated to recognized institutions, orphan facilities, church homes, state-supervised programs. Everything done properly, legally, recorded in the system where it belonged. The order was signed within 2 days. The riders left Knoxville the following morning. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in the quiet valley of Harrow Creek, the cabin continued its evening lessons. Inside, one of the older students was reading aloud from a weathered history book. Younger children listened closely. Nora sat nearby, sewing a torn coat sleeve while occasionally correcting a pronunciation. The atmosphere was calm, routine. But outside the cabin, something unusual was happening. At the far edge of the valley, a boy named Thomas was sitting on a fallen log watching the ridge trail. Thomas was 13, one of the first children Nora had taught nearly 7 years earlier. He had learned something important during that time. The hills speak, not with voices, with movement. Dust patterns on distant trails, birds startled into the air, reflections of sunlight on metal far away. Late in the afternoon, Thomas noticed something that made him sit up straight. 6 riders, still miles away, but moving toward the valley. And unlike Mercer's visit months earlier, these riders were not traveling quietly. They were riding with the confident speed of men who believed the land ahead belonged to them. Thomas stood immediately. Within minutes, he was moving quickly through the woods along paths invisible to outsiders. The message traveled the way it always did, child to child, hill to hill, a quiet relay across the forest. By the time the riders reached the first bend of Harrow Creek, the cabin already knew they were coming. Inside, Nora closed the book the children had been reading. She stood slowly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the younger girls asked the question everyone else was thinking. "More visitors?" Nora nodded once. "Yes." "Like the last man?" Nora looked toward the darkening hills through the open doorway. She could already feel the valley shifting, watchers taking position, paths closing, children moving to places they had practiced reaching many times before. "No," Nora said quietly, "not like the last man." Outside, the forest was becoming very still, because this time the riders coming to Harrow Creek weren't arriving to understand the school. They were coming to end it. What they didn't realize yet was that the school they intended to destroy had never really been a building at all. And in the hills around them, dozens of young minds were already moving according to a plan the officials had never imagined existed.